It's March 3rd, 1865, and America is still split between the North and South during the Civil War. However, President Abraham Lincoln was already thinking of problems after the Civil War, including placing freedmen into a free labor society. But what's the best way to do this? President Lincoln had an idea. So on March 3rd, 1865, President Lincoln founded the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And the commissioner that President Lincoln put in charge? This guy, Union General Oliver Otis Howard. The Freedmen's Bureau mostly worked in the South, where many former slaves were coming from. It was organized into districts covering 11 former Confederate states, which bordered the states of Maryland, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. The Bureau was under the United States Department of War, since they were the only ones who could enforce the Freedmen's Bureau in the South. The first workers of the Bureau were Union Civil War soldiers and veterans. After the Civil War, there were many freed slaves who didn't know where to start in a free labor society. This is where the Bureau came in to provide practical aid to African Americans in their transition from slavery to freedom, and to poor Southerners in the aftermath of the Civil War, too. Some things the Bureau agents did were confront unfair labor contracts, forced landowners to bargain with workers and tenants, advised freedmen on economic matters, and provided direct payments to families. The Bureau also had land confiscated from or abandoned by Confederates during the Civil War, and attempted to settle former slaves as landowners. The Bureau was especially active in establishing schools for African Americans. They had a part in founding Fisk University, Hampton Institute, Tougaloo University, and Clark Atlanta University. The Bureau also worked closely alongside the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, which sought to encourage and guide economic development among the newly emancipated African American communities. However, the Bureau faced many problems during the Reconstruction era, including shortage of funds, shortage of staff, Bureau agents being corrupt or unqualified, and the failure of Bureau civil courts. In April 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and replaced with President Andrew Johnson, and he was one of the problems. Former slaves never got to be landowners, since President Johnson gave the land back to pardoned Confederates. During the Reconstruction era, the bank went bankrupt, and Congress refused to compensate its 61,000 depositors. Many were African Americans. The Bureau was further weakened by resistance from white Southerners, including attacks from the KKK. Southern legislatures also passed black codes, which restricted civil rights of African Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau struggled to last through the Reconstruction era, before Congress ultimately abandoned the program in 1875. The Freedmen's Bureau was significant for being the first federal welfare agency. The first federal agency in history that provided direct payments to assist those in poverty and to foster social welfare. To make a connection to another event in history, let's go forward in time, specifically to 1950s and 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement. The Freedmen's Bureau can be seen as a predecessor to the Civil Rights Movement. Although the Bureau failed in making major breakthroughs, they both strived towards equality and civil rights for African Americans. Despite resistance in the South,